Right, we're recording. Excellent. So we are going to have a look at the conflict and tension module, the interwar years, and that's divided into 3 sections. They are going to come up on your mock exam. There is going to be a question about the Treaty of Versailles. There is going to be a question about the League of Nations, and there's going to be a question about Hitler's actions. And then there's a last question, a 4th one, which is usually a big overview question that will get you writing about a number of factors that are linked to the topic. And we will explore those questions in class and in revision later on, okay? But at the moment, we're just going to try and recap some of the key content. Now, if I were you, I would be making some notes, or I'd at least have my notes in front of me, so I'm reading through what I did in class. Now, I know just plucking your book out of thin air might not be the easiest thing for you to do now, but maybe when you do come to revision in the future, you come armed with your textbook, your exercise book, or at least some paper ready to write down some of the key information. We're not going to write it down all of it. You've got the detailed stuff in your exercise books. We're going to do a bit of a brief overview now to try to get through as much as possible. So, first thing, the Treaty of Versailles. It was called they were called the peacemakers in your first mock exam, and that threw you a little bit, didn't it? If they were called the Big Three, then maybe that would have pointed you in a clearer direction. But we're going to have a look at the people involved in signing and making the Treaty of Versailles. And 3 big countries dominated proceedings: Britain, America, and France. They became known as the Big Three, but they also are the peacemakers. Everybody at Versailles was the peacemakers. So we're going to have a look at the Big Three and what they wanted. Hopefully, you know. If I move off of, I'm not even sure, you're probably seeing now the screen, the team screen. Can you remember, we're going to do Woodrow Wilson really briefly. Can you remember what Woodrow Wilson wanted? Just type in the chat bar now. Hit the chat bar with what Woodrow Wilson wanted. Quick as you can. 14 points, Dom. Very good. 13 is close. 14 is better. It is a 14-point plan to make a better world. Good. 14 points for peace. Yes, dream. He was a dreamer. Absolutely. He was an idealist. A League of Nations Woodrow Wilson wanted. Good. Let me go over this stuff in a minute. Fancy words like self-determination, arms reductions, Leagues of Nations, and so on. Yes, you're right. Okay, let me go back to the PowerPoint. So, come on, Woodrow. Going on, I've clicked on slideshow and now it's frozen. Okay, I'm not even going to worry about that. Okay, right. You should be able to see Woodrow Wilson in front of you, and there are 4 speech bubbles around him. And you need to know the specifics. You need to know some detail about what this man wanted to achieve at Versailles. And I'm going to start in the top left-hand corner, and that's all about secret agreements, secret treaties. Remember when we studied World War I in year 9? And we looked at the reasons for World War I and how countries made alliances with other countries. So if one country got into trouble, another country had to jump in to defend them. That ensured that the war was much bigger than it needed to be, because lots of people got dragged into a conflict that had nothing to do with them, a little bit like what happens in school. So no more secret treaties, Woodrow Wilson wanted. Next one, reduction in the number of weapons. Arms reduction. Smart move, isn't it? Countries with less weapons are less likely to go to war. And you've already mentioned that you had a 14-point plan for peace. Dom, you said he was dreaming. He was a dreamer, but in a good way. He was using this as an opportunity to create a safer, better world. And a part of that was a reduction in the number of weapons that countries have. The next thing that he wanted, and this is where you start to get extra marks, okay? Let me start that again. Let me do that. There you go. Self-determination. It's a fancy way of saying no more empires. Now, that's a good idea in theory, but there are plenty of countries that have empires around the world that would not want to follow that point. Britain, as an example. So Britain was going to clash with Woodrow Wilson over this point. And this is a big issue with Versailles. So many countries had different ideas on what should be done after World War One. We needed more compromise. Unfortunately, we didn't get that. So that was the self-determination bit. And the last one that you mentioned, a League of Nations. To help countries talk through problems to avoid another war. Now, these are just 4 examples from his 14 points, but they are 4 really important examples that set America in their own kind of area. There's nothing here aimed at punishing Germany. Everything here is aimed at creating a safer world. Okay, so that's the American standpoint. Clemenceau, now at the other end of the scale. America, 14 points for a better world. Clemenceau, none of that, just let's hammer Germany. And we can understand why, can't we? Because France have experienced so much more hardships compared to the Americans. The Americans hadn't suffered the same number of deaths. They hadn't suffered the same amount of economic destruction. France's businesses were destroyed. Towns, villages laid to waste. So it's understandable why the French were somewhat angry with Germany. And blinded by the rage, they were not thinking about creating a better world. So first thing, money. I'm going to come back to that word in a bit, payments. It's called reparations. Off the top of your head, can anybody remember? Can you go to full size? I tried that a minute ago, whoever wrote that, and it just did not work. I'm going to try it again. Write in the chat bar now who how much reparations were paid. No, for whatever reason, it won't go on full screen. So, unfortunately, you're going to have to deal with what it's like. I hope that you can still see it. I think you probably can. So, 6 billion, you're close. Yeah, 6.6 billion, absolutely, Ross, yeah. And well done, Lauren and Savannah. And somebody wrote 6 million up at the top with a question mark. I think that was Dom. I'm not sure, though, I'm blaming Don, but it might not have been, it was. No, 6.6 billion, which is 6,600 million. Yeah, that was a clever idea, right at the end of World War One. So anyway, France wanted reparations. She also wanted to make Germany weak. So that's destroy the German military. You can understand why France wanted to do that. They felt threatened. France also wanted revenge. As soon as you want revenge, you don't make sensible decisions. You are blinded by anger, you're blinded by rage, and that sometimes leads you to make very bad decisions. And I think this is what happened at Versailles. France was not looking long term. They weren't thinking long term. What's going to happen 20 years down the line? They were just thinking, right, we must punish Germany now. And then lastly, the war guilt clause, that Germany had to admit that the war was all their fault. That's an extreme element of the treaty because it doesn't help France to feel safer. It doesn't help any country to rebuild. All it does is humiliate Germany. It embarrasses them on the world scene. So why include it other than just to punish them, to exert revenge? And that's wrong. That's not what countries should have been doing at Versailles. Okay, so that's the French. And you need to know these specifics. You can't just say that France wanted to destroy Germany and America wanted to allow Germany to recover. You've got to be able to talk about it in detail. Lastly, then, David Lloyd George, not the American, he's British. He's the British Prime Minister. So the first one, top right, he wants to keep the empire strong and united and well defended. This would ensure that he clashes with Woodrow Wilson because Woodrow Wilson wanted self-determination. We're going to have a look at these arguments in a moment, so you don't need to write it all down now. Next one. He does side with the French, okay? He understands where the French is coming from. And to be fair, many people in Britain also side with the French, and they demand that Germany be made to pay. They must be punished. But secretly, Lloyd George worries what will happen in the future if Germany is punished too severely. So there's part of David Lloyd George that is siding with the French. Let's punish Germany. The British people demand it. There's a worry what might happen further down the line. Unfortunately, France wasn't worrying about further down the line. And then lastly, just over here, bottom left, we're only going to do 3 of these. He also sides with the Americans because he understands the importance of Germany's recovery. Britain is a trading nation and we rely upon Germany as a trading partner. If Germany is brought to its knees and its economy collapses, that is going to make it more difficult for Britain to recover after World War I. World War I has devastated us. We need to recover. And Germany is part of that recovery, or at least trade with Germany is part of that recovery. So if you hammer them too hard, it's going to have an adverse effect on British recovery. So those are the big 3. There are key words in there that you must be able to use. Things like self-determination, League of Nations, reparations, key things. So, I mentioned a moment ago that we're going to have a really quick look at some of these arguments that were going to arise from Versailles. So you should be able to see the online textbook. It's a bit blurry at the moment until I zoom in. So if I zoom in lots, there we go. Right. I want us to pay specific attention to rounds 3, 4, and 5. They've set this out a bit like a boxing match where the individuals are going to be sparring and fighting over key issues. So round 3, one of the arguments is going to be between Clemenceau and Wilson. Clemenceau went to Versailles with revenge on his mind. Wilson went at the other end of the scale. There's not an ounce of revenge in Woodrow Wilson's thinking. It was all about idealism, trying to create this better world. Like I said a moment ago, he was a dreamer, but in a good way. We need people like Wilson. They make the world a better place. Clemenceau, unfortunately, he was not approaching this in a way of trying to make the world a better place. He was blinded by rage and revenge. So round 4 of our boxing match is going to be between Woodrow Wilson and David Lloyd George. Woodrow Wilson wants self-determination. No more empires. Empires are bad. When little countries are kept in big empires against their will, their people get angry, they might end up fighting back, and that could then lead on to a world war, just like happened in World War I. So Wilson's self-determination versus Lloyd George's keep the British Empire strong. And then last round between Clemenceau and Lloyd George. Clemenceau wanted huge reparations, 6.6 billion. Britain, although they wanted money, some money for recovery, they wanted a stable Germany. Huge reparations are not going to make Germany stable. So these two would have argued over those points. So just some things to think about now, why the big 3 at Versailles were going to find it so difficult to come to an agreement, because they all wanted such different things. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint now. And I'm going to bring up the Treaty of Versailles. Now, unfortunately, I'm not sure how big this is. Once again, I cannot make it full screen. I don't know what's going on, and I really don't want to waste the time trying to work it out. So hopefully you can see this clearly. You've got this in your exercise books because I printed it out and I gave it to you to glue in. Now, what you need to remember from this treaty is the 5 key areas. Once you remember the 5 key areas, you can start remembering some of the detail that goes with them. So I'm talking about German land. The treaty targeted German land. It targeted the armed forces. Just below that, you've got reparations. Next to that, you've got the League of Nations. And then at the very bottom, you've got the war guilt clause. 5 key areas that the treaty dealt with. Now, looking at this treaty, I think we've all agreed upon this, and we definitely did in class. It seems, looking at it, that France got their own way. Okay, when we look at what goes on here, is it aimed at creating a better world? No. Is it somewhere in the middle of creating a better world and punishing Germany? Not really. If it was a sliding scale, I would put this nearer the end that punishes Germany. Because, have a look at the German land. Simply carved up and given away. Posen was given to Poland, which split Germany in two. Further down, it mentions that 12.5% of the German population now lived in foreign countries because of the land grab that happened. Other countries grabbed the German land. It was given away to them under the treaty. Germany ended up losing 10% of all of its land, and it was banned from uniting with Austria. Well, Hitler stuck two fingers up to that later on with the Anschluss, didn't he? Anyway, okay. The German land was carved up and given away, and it created hardships in Germany for normal people that had nothing to do with the war. That's why people grew a hatred of the treaty and the countries that signed it. On the far right, you've got the armed forces. The army was reduced to 100,000 men, no aeroplanes, no submarines, and only 6 ships. France would be happy with that. That is not an army that is going to be able to attack France. France should feel safer. Below that, we've got the reparations that were set at 6.6 billion or 6,600 million. Just as Germany lost a war, that's a little bit silly. They're not going to be able to pay that back, are they? But that's what France wanted, and that's what France got. Excuse me. Next to that, we have the League of Nations. Go Woodrow Wilson. He gets one of his points into the treaty, okay, his beloved League of Nations that is aimed at creating a safer, better world. And then just below that, we've got the war guilt clause. Once again, France should be happy because it just sticks it to Germany whilst they are down. Okay, they're already suffering, and this just makes them suffer even more, embarrasses them even more on a world scale. Okay, so this is the Treaty of Versailles, and you should be trying to remember some of the key detail for the 5 key areas. Okay, dare I say, many of you might already know some of it, which will be good. Okay, so the treaty had been signed. They rushed it through. They had to rush it through. There was a sense of urgency. The world had to be seen to be making progress. We could not spend ages, years trying to decide what to do with Germany. So the peacemakers, the big 3 especially, were under extreme pressure to get the job done. And unfortunately, this is the job that they got done. This is what happened. And none of them were happy about it. And that's what we're going to have a look at next. So I'm going to go back to one second. No, I'm going to go back to the textbook. And I'm just going to go on Teams to make sure nobody's written anything. Remember, if you want to ask anything, just hit the chat bar, not the chat bar, unmute yourself and ask me that way. Okay. Hide that over there and zoom in again. We're having a look at how satisfied the big 3 were with the treaty. And we're going to have a look at Britain first. In fact, before we get to Britain, let's have a look at that source. Let's have a look at that little cartoon. We need to do more source analysis. So have a good look at this cartoon. It's in the textbook. And it was a cartoon that was made immediately after the Treaty of Versailles. Have a look at it. You can see a little child crying. Above the child, it says the class of 1940. Let me zoom in a little bit more. Okay, it's hard to see, but it says 1940 class. And then you've got Clemenceau, Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, and Orlando from Italy, but we're not going to worry about him. He's not important, okay? So you've got the big 3 there, and they notice the child crying, and you can see Clemenceau at the front, and he's looking back. And there's a little caption at the bottom. It says, "The tiger," that's Clemenceau, and he's saying, "Curious, I seem to hear a child weeping." And up at the top, it says, "Peace and future cannon fodder." Cannon fodder is something that, well, fodder is food. So basically this is food for cannons, future food for the cannons, future casualties, I suppose, for the cannons. And then lastly, just by the little child's foot, you can see a bit of paper. It says the treaty, the peace treaty, okay? So that's the Treaty of Versailles. Now, what is this source telling you about the treaty? This was made after the treaty, and somebody has decided to poke fun at the treaty, take the mick out of it by drawing this cartoon. What is the meaning? Unmute yourselves now. People be brave and just let's just talk about it together. Right, let's take the child first. Why is the child crying?
Is it because German, like it's representing Germany and like what they've done?
Yeah, 100%. Is that Ross?
Dom.
Okay, sorry, Dom. Yeah, 100%, Dom. Absolutely. The child represents Germany, and the child is left crying. What is at the child's feet? The Treaty of Versailles, suggesting that the peace treaty is going to cause hardships in Germany. Why have they drawn a child there and written the class of 1940 above it? What happens in 1940? Actually, 1939.
World War II.
Yes, World War II. So this child is going to grow up to be the class of 1940. This child represents the future that then goes on to start the war. So this cartoon is poking fun at the treaty and saying, look, the treaty's so harsh, it's punishing little children now in Germany that are going to grow up and become very angry with the Treaty of Versailles, and potentially it could lead to another war. Why do you think the child's naked? What does that represent? Do you think it represents the hardships created in Germany because of the treaty? I think so. I don't actually know for certain. That's why cartoons are always, they're left to interpretation. But I think it could add to the hardships that this child was now going to experience because of the treaty. Now, let's go to the bottom bit, to the text. It says, curious, I seem to hear a child weeping. So does this suggest that Clemenceau understands the hardships that Germany is going to face in the future because of the treaty? So it's curious, I seem to hear a child weeping. So it's like he knows that there is a child weeping. He knows that Germany is going to struggle, but he doesn't care. And then lastly, let's have a little look at the title of the cartoon, Peace and Future Cannon Fodder. So this cartoon, once again, it's saying, look, it's taking the mick out of the treaty. It's saying, look, they've signed a peace deal, but this peace deal is going to lead to problems in the future. Cannon fodder. Another war where men are sent aimlessly to their deaths into the cannons. Does that make sense? This source has appeared on past exam papers. I wish that I made more of it in the lesson because it is in the textbook, but you will get sources like this. It might say, source A is critical of the Treaty of Versailles. How do you know? What was your one in the mock? Was it about the Tsar? Source A supports the return of the Tsar to Germany. How do you know? So you're going to get something like that this time round, where you're given a source and it says source A, for example, in this case, is critical of the Treaty of Versailles. How do you know? And you'll talk about what we have just mentioned. And to be fair, it's only I've got to have a look in the exam. It's only a 4-mark question, so you're not expected to write a massive essay from this. You're just expected to pull out the details and prove how this is critical of the Treaty of Versailles, just like we've done. Okay, So let me zoom back out now. And we'll have a look at who was satisfied with the treaty and who was not satisfied with the treaty. So we're going to have a look at Britain first. Now, the British people had lost, family members. It says there was barely a single family in Britain who had not lost a son, a brother, or a husband, to war. Britons were ready to see Germany pay, not just in money, but see Germany punished. Okay, so the British people wanted to see the Germans punished. Scroll down here. Maybe it'd be better if I zoomed out a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so what did they think about the treaty itself? Were they happy with it, or did they think it could be even harsher? I'll tell you what, it was both. They thought it was fair. It was harsh. Britain could see that. British people could see that it was harsh. But many in Britain, British people, felt it could be harsher because Germany were the losers. They had started the war and they needed to be punished. And if you've lost a family member, you can understand why people are angry. So there were plenty of people in Britain that felt that the treaty was a good thing. It was fair, but it could be harsher. What about Lloyd George? Did he think the same as the British people, or did he think somewhat differently? Nobody's jumping in, so I'll tell you the answer. I think you probably know it. David Lloyd George thought differently, There were parts of the treaty that he was pleased with. Britain got extra colonies, and it maintained its empire. However, David Lloyd George was mostly unhappy with the treaty. He felt it was too harsh, and he was concerned that the loss of German land was going to cause huge problems in the future. When somebody comes along, Hitler, when somebody comes along who wants to reunite the German people who now live in foreign lands because of the treaty, David Lloyd George knew that this was going to come back to bite them on the backsides, because eventually a German leader might come along who wants to reunite those German people, and that's exactly what Hitler was elected on a promise to do. Do you remember what those German people are called, living in foreign land? Keyword. Maybe you know, maybe you don't, maybe you're being shy. It's the Volksdeutsche. I'm going to check the chat, Remember, I can't really see the chat at the same time, so nobody's written anything. Yeah, so the Volksdeutsche. David Lloyd George was worried that this loss of land and loss of people to foreign countries was going to cause problems in the future. And then lastly, David Lloyd George thought the reparations were too harsh. He realised it was going to hit the German economy very hard, and Britain would lose an important trading partner.
Didn't he suspect there'd be another war in another 20 years?
Yes, absolutely. He actually publicly said that, that he worried that another war would be caused by this in years to come. He specified within 20 years, and he wasn't that far off, was he? So yes, he was a smart man. He was thinking long term, where unfortunately France was not. So let's scroll down a little bit to the French. Were the French happy with the Treaty of Versailles? No, they were really, really unhappy with it. They thought that Germany should be punished severely, and they felt that the treaty did not go far enough. They were happy that they were no longer threatened by Germany, and they were going to receive reparations. France was happy with that, but there were a number of things that they were unhappy with. They felt that the treaty did not go far enough. I think that Clemenceau did a damn good job, You look at the treaty and you think, well, actually, a lot of that sides with what the French wanted. But the French people felt betrayed. When he came home, they felt betrayed that he had somehow let Germany off the hook. He'd missed his opportunity to punish them even further. In fact, also, although he was quite happy with the job he'd done, he also felt that the treaty should have gone further and should have punished Germany further. So let me scroll up here. And we say, however, many people were furious with the treaty. They wanted to destroy Germany. They wanted to make Germany suffer like they had suffered during the war. And this is the big problem. That's kind of what the treaty did. The treaty didn't punish the German leadership or the German army. The treaty punished normal German people that had nothing to do with the war. And they felt they were just being picked on by foreign nations. So when Hitler rocked up and said, hey, look, vote for me and I'll destroy the Treaty of Versailles, all of our problems in Germany have been caused by foreign powers, the average German person thought, he's making sense. Everything he's saying is right. Okay, so Clemenceau was also angry with the treaty because Germany was allowed to retain an army. He wanted it gone completely. He wanted the Tsar permanently, not just given to 15 years. He wanted it permanently. And actually, it's worth pointing out that at the end there, that when there was an election, Clemenceau lost his job. He was voted out, which kind of symbolizes how much the German, how much the French people despised, not despised, but felt that the treaty let Germany off the hook somehow. I don't think so at all. But hey, I'm not French and I didn't live through World War One. Just going to give you a few more seconds to finish writing that if you are. This is a good time to practice your note-taking skills, writing at speed. Hopefully many of you, will go to university. Uni's a brilliant place, it really is. Go, I encourage you to go. But you'll also end up taking lots of notes. The lecturers kind of stand behind a lectern at the front of the big hall and they will just read and you've got to note stuff down as they read. It's a skill which we practice in school. So let's do the last one, the USA. What did the USA think about the Treaty of Versailles? Well, the Americans felt it was unfair. It says there, felt it was unfair and it helped Britain and France to become more powerful at the Germans' expense. So the American people didn't like the treaty. And I think it's an obvious question if I ask you, did Woodrow Wilson like the treaty once it had been signed? Probably not. There's not really much on the treaty aimed at creating a better world. There are not many of his 14 points. League of Nations is there, but not many. Okay. So the American government, Woodrow Wilson just leads the government, but they have their own opinion, and many of them favored isolationism. They did not want to get involved in future European problems. So this treaty is harsh, it's almost unfair on the Germans, and we're going to stay completely out of it. We're going to isolate ourselves now from European problems because we do not want to potentially get dragged into another world war. It's worth pointing out that the treaty, this includes the League of Nations, had to be ratified by the US government. Well, it's a branch of the government, the Senate. And because much of the treaty was not based on Wilson's 14 points, they refused to sign it, which means they did not lend their support to the Treaty of Versailles, and it meant that America could not join the League of Nations. Who wants to join? Lauren's been kicked out. Let's let her back in. Hi Lauren, welcome back. I'm assuming you got kicked out. Not by me, technology. So the treaty had to be ratified by the US government. They refused because it didn't really follow Wilson's 14 points. They didn't want to say that they supported it. Ratifying it says that you support it. And as a result of that, they did not join the League of Nations, which is a disaster. If we're going to have an organization aimed at keeping world peace, we want that organization to be as strong as possible, and having America involved in it would make it stronger. So unfortunately, and it says it there, America could not join his beloved League of Nations. He tried, he toured America, it says down here somewhere, there it is. He desperately toured America to try to get them to join the League. Not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, he wasn't trying to get the Americans to say that they support the treaty. All he wanted to do was to get them to sign up to the League of Nations, but they refused. They favoured a policy of isolationism, which was bad. In these interwar years, I think the world would have been a safer place if America joined in those world politics and helped to solve some of the crises that occurred throughout the 1920s and 30s. I like this cartoon. Okay, it's called Seeing Things. Taking the mick out of the Americans, saying, look, they're seeing things that aren't there. And we've discussed this in class. The League of Nations is at the foot of the bed with an olive branch, and it's represented by a dove. A dove is a bringer of peace, and an olive branch is like a branch of peace, isn't it? If you give somebody an olive branch, you put the hand out of friendship. And here is America, or the American government, the senator there, underneath the covers, looking terrified of the League of Nations, because it's something bad, according to the Americans. And he says, see that horrible vulture? Take it away, take it away. Well, from the Americans' point of view, the League of Nations is not this bringer of good. For the Americans, it's a bringer of death. It's like a vulture, and they want it gone, far away from them. Because their opinion is that this little dove, this League of Nations, will drag them into future problems. I can totally understand where they're coming from. Okay? So, nobody was really happy with the treaty. What we're going to look at next is how it affected Germany. And if I zoom in again, it will be a bit clearer. So how did the treaty affect Germany? Well, it affected Germany in a terrible way. It was a harsh, harsh punishment. In fact, keyword there, it was a diktat, which is a forced treaty. Germany had nothing to do with it, and it was forced down their throats. The government that signed it in Germany became known as the November Criminals for accepting it. Many German people felt that the German government should have never accepted it and refused to sign it, refused to agree to it, refused to pay anything, stand up for themselves. So, how does it affect Germany? Well, prior to the treaty, okay, before the treaty, there was already chaos in Germany. We have a new German government, the Weimar government. They write the Weimar Constitution, which is basically a list of rules for a new democratic Germany. Germany has never been a democratic country before, ever. And now it was. Let me go back a little bit before the treaty was signed. Sorry, I was meant to do it. I said it and then jumped the gun. The Kaiser, the king, had to abdicate. Okay. As soon as the war was over, the king was forced out. That meant the communists then tried to take over. So there was chaos and bloodshed and fighting on the streets of Germany. Then the treaty is signed and we get this new democratic government. Germany's never had a democratic government before. This is the first time, and it is rubbish. It is weak. They argue over everything and nothing seems to be done. They're not making decisions to help Germany recover. So, March 1920, there's another armed overthrow of the German government. It's not successful. It became known as the Kapp Pushk. A pushk is a revolt. And the government narrowly held on to power. But it's more chaos in Germany. Why is this chaos happening? Well, the German people are blaming the Treaty of Versailles for it. Then it was decided that Germany had to pay 6,600 million. Crazy numbers. They start to pay it, but then they quickly run into trouble and they miss a payment. France reacts in a terrible way. France decides to invade the Ruhr, to take their pound of flesh. If they can't get the cash, then they are going to go and get the industrial goods, sell those goods and get their money that way. Okay, so the German workers, understandably in the Ruhr, they go on strike. And this is where the German government makes a really bad decision. They decide to print more money to pay the strikers. As a result of that, inflation takes hold in Germany. And by November, we've got a crisis, a hyperinflation crisis, where people's life savings are wiped out. And I'm not just talking about the poor and the middle class. I'm talking about everybody. The rich, the middle classes, the poor, everybody loses everything. Life is miserable. People are dying and starving on the streets. And then along comes Hitler, and Hitler says, hey, look, vote for me, and I will solve all of your problems. And when there is a crisis in Germany, the Nazi Party's popularity soars. It's worth pointing out that these problems, these hyperinflation problems, are solved by taking out huge loans from Germany. No, not from Germany, from America. It became known as the Dawes Plan. Hitler was dead set against this. He hated the idea of being in debt to a foreign country. And everything looked fine up until 1929, when the Wall Street crash happened and America started to demand back some of its loans, plunging Germany into depression all over again. Hitler looked like some sort of guru, some sort of fortune teller, because he predicted this would happen. And following from the 1929 economic depression, the Nazis became the biggest party in Germany. More people supported them than ever before, because Hitler was promising solutions, easy solutions to rather difficult problems. So, nearly done. Just looking up here, some of the other things. Now, we made a note of this in your exercise book. You added it to a spider diagram, I think, but I'd have to see your book to know for certain. It's just some of the other things that the Treaty of Versailles caused in Germany. The German government claimed that 750,000 people died of starvation. They'd lost their rich coal fields. They lost 16% of all of their coal production, 48% of their steel production, 13% of its land, although the document that I just showed you on the Treaty of Versailles said 12.5% of its land, but it's near enough, isn't it? 6 million Germans found themselves living in foreign countries because of the Treaty of Versailles. It was humiliating. It was embarrassing. They lost their army, which meant France could attack at any stage. And they did, didn't they? In 1923, they invaded the Ruhr to take their money. Well, because Germany didn't have an army, they couldn't defend itself. And that left Germany feeling very vulnerable. So the treaty was devastating for Germany, and we can understand why such a hatred of it built up. It seemed that all of their problems could be traced back to the Treaty of Versailles. Pretty shocking. Okay. What are we up to? I think this is the last bit now. Yeah, we're going to overrun by 5 minutes, but it does mean that we finish the first third of this topic in 45 minutes, which is excellent. And then we can go back over it and answer GCSE questions. Okay, we've got the information. Now we can apply that information to the questions. So this is very similar to what we have just looked at regarding how bad the treaty was for Germany. If we look at the title, it says the negative consequences of the treaty. There were lots of negative consequences. We've mentioned about the German people living in foreign countries, losing 13% of its land. We mentioned David Lloyd George saying that there was going to be another war. I said 20 years in the future, but actually he said 25. My apologies for that. Germany felt vulnerable without an army. They could be attacked at any point. The war guilt clause forced Germany to admit that the war was all their fault, except full responsibility. But as it says up there, the start of World War I was very complex. If you remember the Horrible History sketch, they do it well. They point out that the war started because an Austrian was shot by a Serb in Bosnia. So Serbia declared war on Bosnia. Russia declared war on Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia, but also declared war on Russia's ally France, and in doing so threatened Belgium, which meant Britain jumped into the war. That's a really complex chain of events that led to World War I. So to force Germany to admit that the war was all their fault was somewhat unfair, and it was a negative consequence. It had negative consequences in the future. The treaty was a diktat, a forced peace deal, which Germany had no say in. And this bit's good as well. Germans, now you don't need to remember all of this. It's about remembering a selection. If you're saying that there were negative consequences for Germany brought about by the Treaty of Versailles, it's about remembering a selection and not remembering every single point. Okay. Just lastly, Woodrow Wilson had his 14-point plan, and the German people felt that the treaty was going to be based on these 14 points to achieve a better world for everybody. If they knew that it wasn't going to follow this, then maybe they wouldn't have signed the armistice, which means that they wouldn't have agreed to end World War I. If they knew how badly they were going to be treated, then maybe they wouldn't have surrendered. And then lastly, reparations crippled Germany, and they really did. They brought Germany to its knees economically, which set forth that chain of events that led to the hyperinflation crisis. So, last bit, actually I'm lying, it's the second from last bit. Over here, in defense of the peacemakers. Now, I'm not going to say this is a positive consequence of the Treaty of Versailles, because there weren't any positive consequences. But we can't just hammer the peacemakers too much, because they were in a very, very tricky situation. Okay? Because they were under an extreme time pressure to get something written quickly, to move the world forward. And under that pressure, many people felt that they did the best job that they could. And that says it down there. The peacemakers had to act quickly, and under so much pressure, they did the best job that they could. I will accept that. I will. Okay. Also, in defense of what was signed, Germany lost the war, the most devastating war the world had ever seen. And it was only right, and this has been the case throughout history, that losing countries had paid out after losing the war. They had been made to pay. They were punished. So it makes sense that Germany gets punished. And also, Russia withdrew from World War I before it ended. They surrendered to Germany after the Russian Revolution. And Russia was forced to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which devastated them. It really did. They lost a quarter of all of their farmland and population to Germany. So when Russia surrenders to Germany, Germany treats Russia incredibly harshly. Now Germany has surrendered to the Allies. Surely it's only sensible that Germany be made to pay, that Germany is punished harshly. How the hell can Germany moan about the Treaty of Versailles when we consider what they did to Russia? So it's very easy when you end up writing about the Treaty of Versailles to get caught up on the negativity bandwagon. It was really bad, it punished Germany, it was really unfair, and so on, which it is. Totally agree with that. But a better answer would recognise that actually some aspects of the treaty are totally understandable. The fact that Germany be made to pay is understandable when we look at past wars and how the losers were treated. Also, when we look at how Germany treated Russia when Russia surrendered to Germany during World War I. Germany treated Russia incredibly harshly. How the hell can they moan now about the Treaty of Versailles? And then lastly, they're sticking up for the peacemakers and say, look, they didn't actually do that bad a job considering the time that they had. So, last bit. Very, 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 very last bit. Sorry. Too many more. Here we go. Just briefly looking at the treaties, there are lots of other treaties for Germany's allies, and you are not expected to know all of them. But if you talk about Germany being treated harshly, your answer could be made better by saying, well, look, it wasn't just Germany. Germany's allies were treated harshly as well. For example, Hungary. Let's have a look at Hungary, part of the old Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It was carved up. Austria became one country and Hungary became one country. And if we look at what happens to Hungary under the Treaty of Trianon, we can see that Hungary lost land, just like Germany did. Reparations. Hungary had to pay reparations, although it was not a fixed amount, which in many ways was much fairer. Even so, the Hungarian economy collapsed, so we never actually paid anything in the end. Their army was reduced, they weren't allowed conscription, and they were only allowed 3 patrol boats. So in comparison to the Treaty of Versailles, this is nowhere near as harsh, but Hungary is being punished. They've lost a lot of land. They were meant to pay reparations, but their economy collapsed, so they couldn't pay anything. But they're still being punished because their economy collapsed. And they basically do not have an army to defend themselves. So very similar to the Treaty of Versailles, although not as harsh. So again, if we're sticking up for the peacemakers, we say, look, Germany was punished in many ways the same as its allies were punished. Germany was not being punished by themselves. It's not totally unfair. And all of that brings an end to the big three, the peacemakers, the Treaty of Versailles, how happy they were, satisfied they were with the treaty and its effects and lasting effects on Germany. So, thank you very much, Year 11s. I hope that was helpful to some degree. I always think it is. Talking about over content that you haven't done in a while and talking over it in a whole story format, so this leads on to this and this happens and this happens, helps you to remember it. It really, really does. So do a flashcard on each of those events and read the flashcards one after another until you've gone over the whole of the Treaty of Versailles. Do that lots and lots and lots of times, and dare I say, you will remember much, much more. So the treaty is going to be on the conflict paper. Just having a quick look at it now. As is the League of Nations, and as is Hitler's actions. So yeah, you're going to have to revise this. You're going to have a good understanding of the Treaty of Versailles to help you answer those questions. So go off and revise this now. Next week, we will start the League of Nations. I think we're probably going to have 2 revision sessions to go over the League. All of the stuff to do with Manchuria and Abyssinia. So, have you got any questions? Anything you'd like to ask before I bid you farewell? So Savannah's typing. So nothing's coming up. Anyway, if you've got nothing to say to me or nothing to ask, then by all means you can hang up now and I will talk to you again during our next lesson. So take care, everybody. I'll leave it open just in case anybody's got anything they want to type in the chat right now. So take care. Bye-bye. Yeah, you too, Savannah. Take it easy. Dom, take care, mate. You too, Ross. See you, Lauren and Angelina. Bye-bye. Yeah, Lauren, I know. Don't worry. It can really let you down at times. But keep working hard. I know you're going to do really, really well. So take care. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.